You never see a dollar, a euro, a yen on the ground. It's picked up because it has value. You don't see a lot of littered money.
Imagine your products touch billions of lives every single day, multiple times. That's reality for Indorama Ventures, the world's largest producer and recycler of PET. They produce water bottles, polyester t-shirts, airbags, and today I'm speaking to their global head of advocacy and education, Colm Jordan. And this conversation is so interesting because they have such a massive scale. He needs to monitor whatever is going on policy level globally. He is active in the plastic treaty and he has a very interesting view on his own personal job and a very specific way on how to stay sane amongst all this craziness. So without further ado, here's Colm Jordan. Hi, Colm. It's fantastic to have you here today and to speak with you. I think every single person on this planet has touched one of the products that your company produces. Can you maybe quickly introduce yourself and the organization that you work for?
Thanks for having me, Joel. I suppose the main thing is that my name is Colm and I'm based here in Dublin, Ireland, but I work for Indorama Ventures, a global company with headquarters and listed in Bangkok, Thailand. We make PET fibers and some of the base chemicals that are feedstocks for those and many other materials. So whether it's your shampoo, your detergent, your polyester t-shirt, the airbag in your car, or the PET bottle that you had with your salad for lunch, we're probably touching billions of lives daily. And we have a responsibility with that. So we are leaders in all of our segments. We're the biggest producer and recycler of PET globally, and we take that seriously. So that means that we're constantly trying to make sure that we become a circular business model, that we have the recycling plants that can bring PET back into the circular economy, but also that we're using more renewable feedstocks like bio and recycled material to make sure that we have resource efficiency within not only our business, but our communities and our planet.
Mm. There's a lot to unpack in there, I would say. Let's start with the circularity aspect in general, right? I think today already by numbers, PET as plastic bottle is already one of the most recycled plastics items out there, if not the most recycled. And that goes for both formal and informal systems. So in Germany, we have the deposit return scheme, right, where you can just return the bottle. In other markets, this is the material that the informal sector likes to pick up the most. Can you speak a bit to the numbers, but also towards the limitations of the current status quo?
So about globally, according to the UNEP report, I think globally we're at about between kind of 40 and 50% recycling for PET. In Europe, according to ICIS, we're collecting about 74% of the PET bottles across Europe, and that was in 2023. And the plastic bottles or the PET bottles in Europe, the beverage ones, have on average, according again to ICIS from 2023, about 24% recycled content. So if you look across, people might know, but there's many different types of plastics. So people might know a PVC window, or they might know a nylon cloth, like their airbag, or they might know, specific polyester, different types of plastics. But there's actually many, many, many different types of plastics. And some of them are much more recyclable than others. So even if you take the lowest global estimate for PET and say it's at 40%, I'd argue it's 50, if not higher. But let's say 40. When you look across other polymer types, some of them can be as low as 1%, 2%, 3%. Some may be pushing for 30%, but that's maybe in a certain application. So a particular type of format that plastic is using, rather than actually the global universe of that particular plastic itself. And the reason for that is that it has value. And if we look at recycling in general and how it works and what makes it success and what makes us ensure that it has circularity, we have to give value to the material. So look around you. You never see a dollar, a euro, a yen on the ground. It's picked up because it has value. You don't see a lot of littered money. And if you do, it's usually low value currency that you see littered. So you have to give value to PET. And because PET, or to all waste rather, and because PET is so recognizable, so we all know that it's a beverage container, and we know that that beverage container contains PET, that means that people can sort it, separate it, and recycle it easily because they know it has a value. If you have a place where maybe landfilling is totally free, well, then why would you bother to sort and separate something if you can just landfill it for no cost or burn it at very low cost? So the economics of recycling and the way that you're able to identify a PET bottle and you know that it's going to give you value because there's an active secondary market buying up PET to recycle it into new applications. That's what pushes PET ahead of other material types. Now, in time, they will get to that when their recycling technology comes up to speed and is scalable globally. But at the moment, it is the value that PET gives that makes sure that it's collected, it's sorted, and it's put back into the value chain.
And I think as Indorama, you're in a quite interesting situation, right? Because on the one hand, you have virgin material. On the other hand, I think by numbers also are the biggest PET recycler globally. And the value of the recyclable feedstock also is driven by demand, but also the interesting part in plastics is you have a virgin price and you have a recycled PET price. And I think as soon as the recycled price gets too high compared to virgin price, let's say 10, 20% is the band that you can play with in extra cost, and people will divert back to virgin. Would you say that this is the core driver why we are at 40% and not, for example, 80%? Or what else has to change?
Price is a factor. There's other things like the law. So in certain parts of the world, they haven't yet updated their food contact guidelines. So, I mean, up until recently, all of India and all of Thailand did not allow recycled PET for beverage bottles. So about 18% of the world wasn't able as a market to produce. And that means that, if you go to a bank and say, please allow me to invest, please allow me to build more recycling plants, they're going to be skeptical because they know that it is against the law for you to produce the material that's there. So food contact material plays another part. Another part is availability. In developed economies like Europe and the United States and East Asia, you have municipalities building waste to energy facilities, and the local municipalities sign a contract with a service provider to build and to operate that facility. And they say to them, okay, please build this for us, and we contract to supply you with material. So it's very difficult for us to get PET and other recyclable materials out of that waste stream when municipalities are contractually obliged to send the municipal waste to these facilities to be burnt. They have to feed these incinerators. So those make up components. But on price, that is an issue. So we have to point out that, unlike virgin, where you can have an extremely large plant, producing a million tons, and that's based on kind of raw chemicals that come in, it runs smoothly. Recycling is complex. So you have to get the bottles, they have to be sorted, they have to be, washed and sterilized and so on. And you can do that on, in comparison to virgin, a relatively small scale. And it must be done locally. There's no point shipping around bales of post-consumer bottles all over the world. You should do it where they're eventually going to be consumed. So that adds a cost. So the purchasing of bales adds a cost. But as we see collection increase and increase and increase, we should expect to see the amount that we're being charged for buying the bales to be reduced, reduced, and reduced. So ultimately, over time, those two prices will come together. And we've seen that in other materials where at one stage you had one price for recycled and one price for virgin, and now they've virtually merged. But the other thing is, despite the price that comes along with recycled PET, which can act as a disincentive, we also have to realize that there's incredible value delivered through using a recyclable material. So oftentimes you'll see big consumer-facing companies make great play and great PR about the fact that they are using recycled materials. You'll see them communicate with investors who are looking to make sure that they have a sustainable investment, and they will promote that to them to make sure that they are available to be invested in by the broadest possible group. You'll see them going to ratings agencies saying, okay, I need to, tick a box on a score, and I need to show to you or highlight to you that I'm using recycled materials. So whilst there are costs there, we can't look at the cost of everything and the value of nothing, as my mother might say. We have to consider, is there an added benefit to this company beyond simply conveying our product to market that is enhancing our reputation, that is enhancing our investor relations, that is enhancing our scores with major rating agencies? So those three key added values must come into consideration when you look at price, rather than simply, how do I convey my product from my factory door through the retailer to the customer?
And I think I've been to India, I've been to Indonesia, Philippines. I grew up in Germany, and wherever you go, you see people collecting PET. Even in Germany, right? People will go through trash bins, or by now it's already a behavior that you put your deposit bottles next to the bin, so people that collect it don't have to dig through the bin, which is proof that there's tremendous value within PET. And because it is so easily recyclable, and I think there's also paths, right? Even if you can't use it as a food contact, you can then turn it into fiber for clothing or for a fleece jacket or whatever, which has its own challenges. But where I'm trying to go with this question is, if I'm a brand and I need to package my goods, are there technical limitations to PET? Because the question that I always ask myself, why is not everything packed in PET if it's such a great material and it can be
Mm.
so easily recycled? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so the straight answer is I don't know. I think that there are some barrier materials. So, if you take, for instance, beer, so beer, that the shelf life in beer can be reduced if you have it in PT. So if I go to a soccer match in Germany, as you say, outside there are people with supermarket trolleys who will collect the bottles to go to recycling. But when I go into the stadium, it's often in PET bottles that my beer is given. But that can last for, say, a couple of weeks, where if it was in glass, it could last longer, because the fizz sometimes would escape given the pressures that are used for beer. So beer is certainly challenging for us. Now, we're overcoming that by using different types of barriers and by manipulating the chemistry of our PET to become a better product. We've recently been able to launch a PET bottle that's suitable for sparkling wines. So when you think about the massive reduction in weight, the massive reduction in carbon footprint, that's becoming increasingly more popular. And I know companies like Alpla have a wine bottle as well. So we're seeing that coming more online. Whilst you mightn't see it on your supermarket shelf today, what I'm certainly seeing is that people are coming to us asking us to create innovation for them. So one of them is the humble yogurt pot. So at the moment, there's many, many different materials in most yogurt pots. They could have a paper wrap. They could have one type of plastic at the top, another type on the bottom, in terms of thickness and materiality and so on. But the big thing for them is they want the yogurt pots to snap apart. That's what they're looking for. And because of the strength of PET, it just wouldn't break apart, because that's how they sell them. They sell them in fours, twos, or sixes. So we, with our polymer engineers, were able to work on that and to deliver a product for them that they can then use. So we're going to see a shift now from people moving out of unrecyclable materials into more recyclable materials, and that's going to happen across the globe. Milk often put into cartons, which are multi-material and can be difficult to recycle, and because of that, they're not reaching the criteria of fully recyclable in practice and at scale. So we're seeing countries like the Swiss began to move into milk produced in PET bottles. So the Swiss are, you can't think of milk in the world, right, thinking of the Swiss people. These are experts in what they do. And that particular shift I thought was very interesting. So you're going to see these shifts coming, and you mightn't see them on your supermarket shelves now, but I think that they are on their way. There is, of course, a huge amount of uncertainty, because we have in the background an elephant in the room, which is the plastics treaty negotiations. So if you're looking to bring out a new product or to materially shift from an unrecyclable material into a recyclable or possibly even recycled material, you're going to want to know what the legislative landscape is like. So, I believe that the plastics treaty should be, we should have an ambitious, agreed, legally enforceable plastic treaty. Just want to say that clearly. What I've been lobbying for is design for recycling rules. I've been lobbying for extended producer responsibility. And I think that when we get there and people see the writing on the wall and they have some sense of certainty on what's going to be there, I think we'll then begin to see big shifts. And ultimately, we could see very similar to the PPWR and to the SUP that we have in Europe, the Single-Use Plastics Directive and the packaging waste regulation in Europe. We're going to see those become globalized through things like the plastics treaty. So with that all being up in the air at the moment, I don't think that people are willing to push the button and to switch everything into PET just yet. But once we
No.
get that circularity behind us and we know what the future holds in certain respects, I think we're going to see a massive move into that area.
What do you think for the plastic treaty itself would be good policy design? Because I think the beauty again of PET is that inherently it's a circular material. And if we think about the milk carton, right, that is not really recyclable, do you think these kind of packaging behaviors should be penalized, or should then have higher EPR rates than, for example, PET? Is there a cost factor behind it, or if maybe we start with that question, because I'd be curious, if you could write the treaty, what would be the things that you would put in there?
I think that, we have to, as, most common sense, everyday people are looking for. I think they're looking for both sides, both kind of, so-called high ambition sides and people who are coming from the other side of that. I think both of those maximalist positions need to be considered carefully. So I think there is a need to kind of get into the granular on this. Okay, so when you're saying, okay, we need to ban plastics, just turn off the tap, get rid of production, all that type of stuff. We don't want less medical devices. We don't want less, life-saving materials. So like blood bags and all this type of stuff. So let's be clear on that. So let's exclude that. Well, then, if you cap production, so this is a pellet. I don't know if you can see it here. So this here is a pellet. Okay, so one of those pellets is going to make a patch that will be inserted into somebody's stomach, maybe to stop their stomach bursting out like a hernia. Another patch will go and make a refillable PET bottle. And another patch will go to make a single-use virgin PET bottle. But so if you go with the production phase, you cannot identify which one of those you're going to restrict. So we have to come in and say, yes, I understand your need for reduction and to move to sustainable alternatives, but we need to do this in a thoughtful way. Shouting, stop plastic and end plastic isn't going to do that. So you have to get granular quite quickly. And at the same time, I think that, industry, states that are major producers and reliant on petroleum, there has to be an understanding on their side of, there is negative externalities to our product. Okay. So, and that has to be accepted rather than, and going to the table and beginning to talk to it. So moving away from these maximalist positions and coming into kind of, everyday conversations that people can relate to and that we can acknowledge, I think has to become part of it. And it has to become evidence-based. If we just end plastic and start using other materials that are less sustainable, then everyone loses. So, there has to be a bit of calm, a bit of common sense, and a bit of rationality, and moving away from maximalist positions on both sides is the only way that we can get there. What I would write is that I would say, look, there are cases where we just have to end things, but we have to be conscious of the negative fallout from that. So I want you to imagine, do you know a sachet that you might have olive oil or vinegar or mustard in,
Yeah.
or if you're in Belgium, mayonnaise for your chips? They're multi-material. They're difficult to sort. There's a lot of them, and it's very difficult to recycle them.
Mm.
So from a Western developed world point of view, you can say, oh, just ban those straight away. However, if you move to the developing world, that type of packaging is being used to deliver things like detergent, soap, what else is there? Shampoo. So developing countries and the people within them simply cannot afford to go out and buy 500 milliliters of shampoo or a liter of detergent or something like that. So they're using these as a way to actually access product to develop them.
Mm.
So there should be a provision for transition, for social justice, for affordability, and acknowledging that, you know, I'm often on calls and I will have people very condescendingly and very smugly turn around and say, we don't need bottled water. This is totally disgraceful. Go to communities that don't have water going into their houses because they don't have houses. And they are grateful to have either a large container bringing water back to their home from the well, or they're grateful when they, in times of need, say a natural disaster, that they can have a PET bottle. So there needs to be some recognition that there is no moral certainty in the positions on both sides and moving towards agreement.
Mm. I think that's a general issue with our society lately, that we have these maximalist positions, and it seems like we can't agree on anything anymore. And the treaty is public theater for just that. And I agree with so many points that you made. I think one thing, if we speak about sachets and the bottled water industry, one of the arguments that then typically comes is, yeah, but the companies benefit from selling these products. They can open up a new consumer group through that. This is then where, for me, the extended producer responsibility comes in, because the thing that I find difficult is if we allow companies to sell a product where they know that there's no system to manage the packaging for it into a market. And I think this is where then extended producer responsibility is so important, that there's money set aside to build the infrastructure to deal with the waste that is created, right? What are your thoughts on that?
I, there must be extended producer responsibility to help make the economics work, but there also has to be a shared responsibility. So it is not the CEO of a consumer facing company or of a material producing company who throws the material, whether it's a beer can, a water bottle, or a potato chip packet, into the ocean. It's
Mm.
not them that are doing it. There are people who are doing that. And society has to take a role in that. So where you have people who are littering, or I mean, littering and illegal dumping are criminal activities in a lot of situations. So if you have companies paying for that, you create a license to do that, because the state isn't
Mm.
going to do anything and say, well, I'll just charge the companies more. So there has to be a shared responsibility where, you know, we as taxpayers contribute for some of those people who are creating illegal activity, because we do it in every other sector. So
Mm.
there has to be, I acknowledge that there has to be something done, but there has to be an honest appraisal of who is doing it. There
Mm.
is a chronic problem with food waste around the world. It generates massive amounts of CO2 emissions. There can be, you know, biopollutants in some of these. Nobody on the planet would say that we need to have less farmers.
Mm.
And if you look at any other situation where you need to regulate or where there's a problem, there's very few cases where you go to the top. You always look at where the negative externality happens.
Mm.
So if we take a serious view on littering, and if we take a serious view on disposal, that is a better way to doing it. And, you know, we also have to be honest. As a society, all of us, whether we're in Sweden, Germany, or the Gambia, or Guatemala, or Thailand, all of us have failed a little bit in terms of being happy that our money that we pay to our municipalities through council taxes or whatever, and the tax we pay, we have underinvested in waste recycling. And we
Mm.
have done this for years. And to now turn around and kind of say, oh, well, it's the big corporates. yes, I think it's true that they should do it, but we have to, reflect on ourselves a bit. So just in the city that I'm in Dublin at the moment, I've seen the number of bins on the street reduce, 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 reduce. Because the councils, if they put bins on the street, they have to figure out something to do with the waste that they collect. So now for people to go around and say, oh, well, there's litter here. Is the litter on the fault of the municipalities? Or is it on the fault of the litter bug? Or is it on the fault of the people who produced it? Or is it of the fault of the material producers? It's all of us. And there's a collective responsibility, a shared responsibility to act on that. And lumping it on one individual, if I say that this whole problem is only to do with litter bugs, I don't think that's helpful.
Mm.
But I think we have to acknowledge that there's a shared approach to it. So that's how I think that we can get to this. And where you have at the moment, many governments and municipalities have the responsibility to pay for waste removal, waste collection, and so on. Where you have EPR, you effectively privatize that system. Now, as a citizenry, we have to ask our governments. I was paying a municipality to deliver a service or a government to deliver a service, waste collection or waste processing. That is now being ostensibly privatized through EPR. Am I getting that money back as a consumer, or are you going to spend it on what are you going to spend it on? So, there's many questions to ask in this space beyond the people who are subject to EPR.
No, I agree with, I think, 80%. Where I think extended producer responsibility is super important is, I mean, through my work, for example, I see informal settlements, right? And there simply is no waste collection. There is no bin nowhere, anywhere. And yet the distribution of products still make their way into these informal settlements. There are companies that benefit from selling these single serve units to people. And I think this is then a collective failure of both the municipalities, but also of the brands that they say, well, this is not really my problem. It's on the municipalities. So there's the Spider-Man meme where all the different Spider-Mans point at each other
Yeah.
and say, it's like, no, it's on you, it's on you. And I think this is where money is important, because or many times these informal settlements are also low income, right? So there's not a lot of tax money. Even if you have 20% of your budget set aside for waste management, that will not be enough to manage scientifically all the waste of the people that live there. And this is where then EPR needs to come in. And maybe it would be fair that this goes a bit far, but if I buy a product from that brand here in Germany, a certain amount is then also there to manage the waste somewhere else as one idea, because I can afford half a cent on the product, which might already be a lot for somebody else that lives from $3-4 a day. But I think that the companies do have a responsibility to see whether or not the areas where they sell their product have these systems in place. And then obviously holding the municipalities accountable to do something with the money is so important. And this is, I think, also the problem that we're trying to solve a bit with cleanup, is to bring in transparency into the waste management process post collection. What actually happens with the waste? Because I think everybody in the industry knows that it's so easy to cheat these systems, right? I can, as a waste management company, claim, yeah, I collected it. Please give me my EPR fees. And then I'm going to go and dump it in the next river because I know that there's no tipping fee from the river or from a landfill. So it is then important to have full traceability on what happens in the process, and is the waste actually then appropriately managed? Because I can fully understand every company that says, I don't want to pay an EPR fee into a black hole, and then I don't know what happens to that money. Somebody building a new palace for themselves or their family in government, or what is happening with my money? What are the labor conditions in these waste companies, right? Because that is the next point where I would like to pick your brain a little bit, the entire social aspect. Also in PET, we do have a big informal sector that is collecting that plastic, and oftentimes also not under the most humane working conditions, but it is bringing value to the family, right? So the world never is black and white. You have different shades of gray in the system. How do you think the treaty can also help in the social aspect of
Well,
waste?
I think it has done a lot, and what I mean by that is that you know the number one thing we need in the informal sector, and I want to acknowledge that I'm saying this as a person who looks and speaks the way I do and who lives in the West, right? So I need to acknowledge that. But from speaking to these communities and from working with them and trying to support them and trying to reach out, one thing that we're missing here is dignity and respect in everything within the informal sector. So you see a lot of kind of paternal and, good-willed work coming in with people rushing into, the informal sector saying, oh, you need protective equipment. Here you go. Here's lots of
No.
protective equipment. Oh, you need more prices. Okay, we'll give you better prices and so on. And I've been guilty of that at times. But realistically, there could be other things that they need when you sit down and ask them. Some of them, what they really need is a bank account. For others, what they really need is maybe a phone. For others, it could be security. So if you're an informal waste picker and you've collected cans and bottles and you know you're going to get value to this and you return it to our factory gate or whoever's, an aggregator most likely, if they pay you cash, when you leave, there's a good chance that you're going to be mugged. So what can we do for the safety in that community? So, and that's an example of something that's maybe overlooked when people come in and say, okay, we need wraparound services, we need protective equipment, maybe the one thing that they really need is a phone.
Mm.
So to be an enabling process rather than a prescriptive, here's what you need. So I think what the treaty has done is it has opened the eyes of many people that this is a well-represented, coherent, policy-based stakeholder that can speak for itself and that demands a seat at the table and demands to be recognized. So, and just by going through the negotiation process itself, that has been a major achievement for the informal sector. And, we all need to wake up a little bit here. About 60% of all the world's waste, not just PET, but just all the waste, 60% is collected by litter pickers. And another important point is that a lot of that community select this as a career. So, and, now let's not forget that there is forced labor, there is child labor, and we have to constantly be vigilant against that, campaign against it, and eradicate it. But there are individuals who choose to do this line of work. And they might enjoy it because of what they do. And of course, it is difficult work, but we have to acknowledge their life choices. And I think coming from a global north or west or developed or however else you might want to say it, there's a wish to put, kind of a mechanical or an automated or, a somehow more morally superior view on all of this. So everybody wants Norwegian style collection bouncing around, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, South America, these parts of the world. That is hugely insulting to the people who are there at the moment and not understanding of the particular circumstances that are there. So, we need to deal with them in the case of dignity and respect. And we also have to build global binding guidelines that are flexible enough to reflect and include an informal sector and not simply take, off the shelf a European EPR and dump it into a country where it's wholly inappropriate. And that means that we have to kind of reimagine EPR in some ways. So in engaging with some of the small island developing nations, what they were saying is that in a small community, they sort all of their waste themselves. So by doing it as a community, they have big piles of PET, big piles of cans, big piles of every different type of material. The issue that they have is how do they get it to a recycling plant? So the island is so small, nobody's going to build a recycling plant there. So they have to ship it off the island. So they're saying, we don't want EPR because, that's just, it's not going to do anything. We've done all the sorting. We need somebody to come along and give us a boat. And you're trying to say, well, if you reimagine EPR, it could be a way of connecting what you've already collected with the recyclers. It doesn't have to be a European off-the-shelf style EPR. So, and that's beginning to happen. It wasn't happening up until INC 5.4, it wasn't. And at INC 5.1, EPR got rejected, and I couldn't believe it. But the reason that it got rejected was because the waste pickers stood up and because they expressed their view and they felt that they were being cut out from this and that their role wasn't valued. At INC 5.2, we began to see things like the Consumer Goods Council published a report on what EPR could look like in low-income nations and middle-income nations. And we began to see the representatives of the informal sector talking more about trying to engage with EPR. So that's how I think it's going to change, and that's how it's going to do it. Just to come back earlier, I think you were talking earlier about, how is it right to put something onto the market, say a single serve sachet or something, if you know. I agree with you, but we also have to try and balance rights. So, we're in a very complex space here where we have to try and balance rights. So, if we do things knowing that, okay, this person's going to have material, but it's not going to be recycled. But on the other hand, we're going to deny them soap, detergent, and shampoo. We have to try and balance it out. And underlying all this, underlying all of our conversations about different things, whether it's in the developed world, EPR in the developed world, or the developing world, or informal groups, underlying all of this is a global shame that we all carry, that we have such a dichotomy on our planet between those that have and those that have not. And, that's not for this podcast maybe, but that's something that maybe we can all take away if we're listening to this to say, are we supporting development NGOs? Are we supporting the Sustainable Development Goals? Are we voting for people who are looking at enabling laws and supports that will raise people out of poverty rather than handouts that will keep them down? And we have to reflect on that. And, the Millennium Goals, we're 25 years in now. Maybe it's time that we revisit those and double down, because we've seen across the world that development aid is being wiped out and disappearing. And we have to make sure that we have a global campaign to increase that and to get that back. Because if we're constantly looking at areas where we have social deprivation, social inequality, that will permeate every issue that we have, whether it's the circular economy, whether it's democracy, whether it's rights, whether it's education, whether it's defense, whether it's immigration, that will permeate everything. And it's something that we have to get right first. Sorry, bit of a rant there, but there you go.
No, not at all. I was about to say, wow, that would be a perfect closing statement. But I have more questions for you if
Good.
you still have the time. And I want to make one correction, right? I didn't want to say we should deny people access to goods. I think everybody on the planet should have access to they are
Essentials.
I'm also missing the English term right now. We don't know if humanity has free will, but they can make their own decisions. I think we don't have to tell people what they can and can't do necessarily. If you want to buy single serve sachet, fine. What I was saying is there's a company behind it, most likely profiting from that sell. And I think they do have a responsibility to look closely into what is also happening post-consumption with my packaged good.
Absolutely. And that comes back to my point about the treaty about, we need to accept the negative externality of a lot of our products.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the cost of sitting at the table and being involved in discussions.
I think in the end, I think even the term sustainability should not be used that much, but we should talk about externalities of processes. There is not a single process in this world that has no externality. Even this podcast recording creates certain externalities that we should, in theory, worry about. We should, in my eyes, treat externalities almost like a commodity, and then capitalism can do its magic and drive the cost down to handle these externalities, while we need monitoring bodies that make sure that social compliance, that the entire social system around is not being ignored, so that these savings
100%.
And I think this should be way more the conversation that should be there, because maybe we can bring the cost of waste management down tremendously, that we don't need that much EPR. And this is where I wanted to ask you that question again, because I see it the same way, right? We have projects across the globe with cleanup. And in some cases, on small island states, it's the logistic costs that need funding. In other cases, you need to fund the infrastructure to bring the cost per ton down. Sometimes you need a truck that you can transport more, sometimes a baling machine that you have less transport costs. So in the end, the communities know best what they need to invest in, be it on a single unit, like one picker knows best what do I need to make my process better, or an entire company or sometimes a municipality can say this is what I need. And I know that you have global responsibility. How do you stay sane as Colm?
Well, I don't think I am sane, but no, it is relentless to see that, one thing that I always find interesting is that everybody has this self exceptionalism. So, we have a policy that works. We know that it works in Australia, Canada, Europe, some island nations. And you go to places and they say, no, 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 that'll never work here. No, you see, we're special because, and, I find that very frustrating that every time you go with a policy solution or you go with some evidence, people will just push back from the table and say, no, 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 here is different. And it's not, I mean, all humankind is the same. We all love our children equally. And similarly, there's policy solutions that work in Thailand that can work just as well in Italy, that can work just as well in Texas. So, you know, I find that very difficult. But the other thing is that there are examples right now of how we can do things better. In Germany, in their natural mineral water setting, we have refillable PET bottles.
Mm.
So, it's not, it's incredibly circular. We have that in South America. We have it in South Africa, the country, where we're seeing large format 2 liter generic bottles being used in refill systems. We're achieving all of the targets that the European Union is setting out for us. So Ireland just recently announced that the DRS is collecting about 74% of the PET bottles. And once you add on what's collected in other streams, you get up to about 90%. So 9 out of 10 bottles are there. So progress is slow, but when you're feeling challenged, I always think that the way to overcome the challenge is basically to work harder. So, if that means that you have to write another policy paper, if that means you have to meet more people, if that means you have to go away and reflect on yourself and lie in the bed at night and say, okay, did I explain myself correctly? Was I coming across as arrogant? Was I coming across as too confident? How can I be more humble? How can I give them the opportunity to have a win? That type of self-reflection allows you to change gears, to change how you're doing it, and to go again. And we, as a company, Indorama Ventures, we have a global leadership meeting where we come together and we hear from our leaders and we get direction for the year. And one of the things they do is they get a guest speaker in. And we got this fabulous native French person who's living in Australia. His name escapes me at the moment, but he was talking to us. And one of the takeaways I got was that he was demanding that we put time into our diaries to reflect and to try and think about it. And one of the things that I do, or that I realized when he was telling me this, is that I walk the dog twice a day. And when I'm walking the dog, I'm usually thinking about, how do I order that PowerPoint presentation? How do I make a different argument? What evidence do I need to make a compelling case? How can I reach the goals that the senior leaders have given me? How can I motivate the team to deliver on our KPIs? So this fantastic business guru coming in and telling us, to put 20-minute or 30-minute segments into our diary to try and reflect. I realized I was doing that because I had a dog who just needed to be walked around. So getting out every day, getting into nature, having that free time, taking off the headphones, thinking about your day, ordering your goals, changing things around, that really energizes me and enables me to go forward.
Oh, it sounds good. With my dog, maybe you can hear her snoring in the background. I have to be careful that she doesn't eat scrap from the street, which brings us back to littering evolution. And I think what is becoming even more evident from this conversation is that the interesting part is, or about plastic, is if you look at it from the outside as a consumer, it looks like such an easy problem to solve, right? Where there's litter, don't do that. Put it in a bin, manage it appropriately. And part of the reason why I want to have these conversations is that we understand the actual complexity behind it, because it's not that simple. And I can imagine that there's a few people listening that also offer solutions in the space. Is there anything particular where you'd be open to have a conversation on? Is there anything that Indorama needs where you always have an open ear? Who should and shouldn't reach out to you?
Well, I'm not commercial, so I think anybody who's looking at a policy discussion or looking at partnerships or looking at memberships or looking at things like that, I think that's where I can add to their space. Kind of procurement, sales, all of that. That's for my betters within the business who are experts in that commerciality. But I think if people are looking to partner, if they're looking to build coalitions on different positions, I think that's somewhere where I'm really comfortable and where I can help. And one of the things is that what we've seen from this treaty is when this treaty is passed and when it has binding and ambitious goals, we're going to move to a COP or Conference of Parties meeting every single year. And when we get to that, we're going to that will pass laws that will then go down into every nation across the world. So there's going to be more and more lobbying. There's going to be more and more advocacy, and there's going to be more and more discussion about it. So we have to shift into a transparency place. So we've published our advocacy transparency report. We got it externally validated by Bureau Veritas, and we're setting out to people what we're saying and how we're saying it and where we're doing it. And I think that's going to become increasingly important. And I'm very interested in hearing about how people can advance transparency, particularly around advocacy and lobbying. We believe we're in the vanguard. We're the only company in the world that has a standalone, externally verified advocacy report, but we want to kind of continue to build on that. And that's something I'd love to hear more about, because with all of circularity, a lot of it comes down, unfortunately, not to fact, but to an opinion. And when you have opinions, that's when you need advocacy to come in and to fill that with an evidence-based foundation. And there's going to be more and more of that. And it has to be regulated and we have to be transparent in it. So let's talk about it.
Perfect. And I'm very happy that basically every statement you make is on point, almost sounds like a closing statement. And I think this is it for now. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Colm. That was very
Honored
insightful.
to be here, Joe. Great to talk to you.
Talk to you soon. Bye.